Okay, so let's unpack this. If you really want to understand why any complex social system is struggling today, I mean, why some problems just feel so intractable, you can't just look at the last few years.
No, absolutely no.
You have to go back. You have to look at the original design, find the blueprints, find those initial inspection reports.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're doing today. We're going back in time, focusing on CLBC Community Living, British Columbia. This whole structure has been the main way supports are delivered to citizens with developmental disabilities for, what, about 20 years now?
That's a long time.
A very long time. And a significant amount of budget and authority is tied up in it.
So to really map out where the current strains might have come from, we're doing a deep dive into an early independent document. It's called The Review of the CLBC Service Delivery Model, and it's from all the way back in October 2008.
Yeah, this document basically gave the brand new model its first real physical.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to pull out the early warnings from that 2008 diagnosis.
Okay, so what were the structural flaws in things like roles, safety, accountability? What was visible right from the very start?
Because what we're going to find is that a lot of the challenges people are talking about now, well, they're not new. They were, in a way, baked into the design almost 2 decades ago.
That sets the stage perfectly. But before we really get into the 2008 review itself, we have to go back even further to the original intent. The report talks about it, specifically a 2001 governance proposal that got this whole thing moving.
Right.
What was the core social promise behind this massive reform?
The foundational promise, and this is rooted right in that 2001 proposal, was that individuals and families would have a, quote, meaningful and permanent voice at the policy table.
A permanent voice.
Yes. The idea was a lasting structural seat for the people actually getting the services. It was supposed to be about, shared governance, real empowerment.
And there was a crucial financial promise tied to all this, which I think a lot of people forget. The proposal guaranteed the reform would happen with efficiencies that would not impact services to individuals and families.
That's the non-negotiable part. The guarantee was service quality stays the same, or maybe even gets better, but the administration gets leaner.
And then there was the whole choice mechanism.
Yeah, coupled with that was this idea of expanded choice. So things like individualized funding and direct funding would be brought in as an option. The thinking was that if you move the money closer to the person, you inherently get better outcomes and you drive efficiency.
So this was not a small adjustment.
Oh, not at all. It was a complete overhaul based on 59 recommendations. The biggest structural shift was moving authority and responsibility for actually delivering the services down to the community level.
While the government held on to the purse strings.
Exactly. Government kept responsibility for the overall funding. And to protect that promised meaningful voice, CLBC was set up through legislation with a really specific requirement.
Which was?
That the majority of its board members had to be self-advocates or family members. That was supposed to be the lock, the mechanism to make sure that people were always heard.
Okay, so let's jump forward for a second just to create a contrast here. We're not interpreting, just comparing the sheer scale of the input. The original promise was this meaningful and permanent voice.
Right.
But if we look at a 2025 independent review, there's a small note in there. It says that out of all the public interest, only approximately 20 public submissions were actually forwarded to that review team through the official ministry email line.
The difference in scale is just. It's striking. The promise was this powerful public voice that would shape policy. The reality we see in 2025 is a funnel that reduced all that feedback to a trickle. 20 emails.
Yeah.
It really highlights the struggle over 20 years to actually make that initial promise of meaningful involvement happen.
Okay, so the promise was empowerment and efficiency that didn't hurt services. But what was the actual problem they were trying to fix? Why did they need this massive change in the first place?
The 2008 report is incredibly direct about the old system's failures. The diagnosis was sharp. One of the, quote, strongest messages they got was that families had almost no choice.
No choice in how or where they got services.
Basically none. It was a one-size-fits-all model.
And the result of that inflexibility must have been devastating. The report says providers were unresponsive, that people didn't get enough support until a crisis hit,
and that crisis services were often too late.
Yeah. So beyond that immediate pain, the whole system was just unsustainable.
Clearly. You had growing wait lists, very few chances for self-direction. It was a system that was buckling financially. At the same time, it was failing the people it was supposed to serve.
So the new model, it was designed around a new set of principles to fix all this. What was principle number one?
Principle one was philosophical. Flexibility of funding. It was about shifting focus from funding programs, which is very institutional thinking, to funding people.
And principle two was more structural.
That's right. The division of planning and funding roles. And this is so important. Before, you often had one person who would assess your need and also control the money. This division was meant to reduce that, that inherent conflict of interest.
So it separates the objective assessment from the gatekeeping.
That was the goal. And this leads right to the philosophical heart of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Moving explicitly away from case management. They wanted to get rid of the worldview that saw people as just cases to manage and start treating them as full citizens.
But that philosophical shift was also tied back to money?
Oh, absolutely. The model was designed with the clear expectation of a possible reduction in the per capita cost. The goal of getting more efficiency and cost containment wasn't an afterthought. It was a fundamental driver of the entire reform.
It's just fascinating how you see these themes repeat. I mean, you look at the source material from the 2025 review, and the main thing people are asking for is a system that sees the whole person, not just a file or a funding category.
It is a direct echo. It tells you that even with all those structural changes back in the early 2000s, that battle to move beyond the case management worldview, to be seen as a whole person, is a persistent, ongoing struggle.
The principle was there in 2008, but the execution.
The execution has clearly remained a challenge 2 decades later.
Okay, now let's get into the 2008 analysis of the new model itself, specifically around cost. We have to start with the scope limitations of this review.
This is a critical detail, yes. This was a review of the model, the structure, the service delivery. But the authors made a very explicit and crucial note. A comprehensive financial audit were specifically deemed out of scope.
Out of scope. But the entire reform was drenched in financial language from day one. We saw words like efficiencies, increased value for money spent.
And the explicit goal of greater cost containment and system sustainability. The system was seen as unsustainable before, so getting efficiency was paramount.
Yeah.
It was how you got the political buy-in for such a big change.
And the 2008 review actually included some specific data on this. They had a table showing the average annual expenditure per supported individual. What did that early data show?
It showed a pretty notable downward trend in what was being spent per person very early on. They tracked it from $51,257 in 2004-05, dropping to $49,513 by 2007-08, and they were forecasting another drop to around $47,400 for the next year. It's a clear downward trajectory.
That's a big financial shift. But the report's authors were careful.
Very careful. They said the data was insufficient for strict assessment, and they framed the trend as just early indications.
And this brings us right to the core problem of public accountability.
This raises the central logical question. If your core promise is that you'll get efficiencies that would not impact services, and you see spending per person going down, but a full financial audit is explicitly forbidden,
then how can the public ever verify that those savings came from, say, administrative efficiency?
Right. How do you test the hypothesis that the savings didn't just come from reducing the level of support to people and families? Without an audit, you're left with a black box.
It's not an accusation.
No, not at all. It's a failure of structural verification. When a core political promise is financial integrity efficiency without harm, you have to provide a way to check that. And in this case, that mechanism was explicitly taken off the table.
That really sets the stage for the structural strains that started showing up. Let's move to that. What were the early warnings in 2008 that this new model wasn't quite working?
Well, first, to be fair, we should note the few positives. The review did mention that downward cost trend with all the caveats, and a lot of participants said there was a better sense of communication and openness. So there were some early wins on the soft side.
But the hard structural problems are what really stand out. The first big one was just process overload. These planning processes, which were supposed to be empowering, were documented as being incredibly complex.
Taking, and I quote, up to 25 hours per plan to complete.
25 hours per plan.
That's a catastrophic number. Just think about the strain that puts on frontline staff. And more importantly, the bureaucratic nightmare it forces on families who are already stressed. It's a sign that the tools meant to help were just unwieldy and inefficient from day one.
That kind of complexity just kills capacity.
And burns people out. And it was tied directly to the biggest structural accountability gap the report found.
Which was that the model removes a fixed, mandated, and ongoing point of contact.
And that's the price you pay for that philosophical shift away from case management. The goal was noble: treat people like citizens, not cases. But the unintended result was this massive responsibility vacuum.
If no one person is required to keep that connection, who's there when things go wrong? Who's the safety net?
Precisely. And that vacuum was made worse by other problems. There was a general lack of shared reporting, teamwork, and communication across the whole new system.
You also had that expectation gap.
Huge expectation gap. Families would go through this insane 25-hour planning process, only to be told, great plan, now you're on a wait list because there's no funding. The plan didn't guarantee the support.
And finally, that very low uptake of individualized funding, the very tool that was supposed to drive choice and efficiency.
Right. So you put all that together, and the report concludes it led to a profound sense of change fatigue.
People were just exhausted. Exhausted by reform that gave them more complexity and more wait lists, not more solutions. And the echo from the 2025 review is just, it's startlingly stripped.
It's the same language. The 2025 review calls for greater transparency in public reporting, accountability. The very thing the 2008 model was missing structurally.
And the confusion over roles. The 2025 review says there's a need to clarify CLBC and agency roles and responsibilities.
Which is the exact confusion created back in 2008 when they removed that fixed point of contact and didn't build in clear team communication.
And then critically, the 2025 report points to a capacity issue, saying, but there are not enough staff.
Yeah, so the strain we saw in that 25-hour planning burden 2 decades ago has now just become a long-term systemic lack of capacity to deliver on what was promised.
So the 2008 review didn't just identify problems. It made 27 recommendations. They were grouped into 4 areas: service delivery model, guardianship, policy tools, and sustainability. But what was the most telling correction they proposed?
The most revealing one, by far, was the recommendation to partially reintroduce case management for some people.
Wow. So after this huge philosophical push to get away from case management,
The 2008 review implicitly admits that the danger created by that responsibility vacuum was so serious that they had to bring the safety net structure back, at least in part.
it's a structural admission that the foundational shift created a major functional failure.
That is exactly right. It showed that the principle of citizen-centered planning was great, but it was structurally incomplete. It needed an accountability mechanism to ensure there was continuity of care and a mandated relationship.
The review also gave some hard deadlines, which is always useful for tracking history, especially for these contract reform tools.
Yes, they expected provincial practice guidelines to be fully up and running by the end of the 2008-09 fiscal year,
And they gave a timeline for something called CMS, or the upside contract.
which was basically a new centralized system for standardizing how contracts with agencies were handled that was supposed to be fully implemented in the spring of 2009-10.
So when we connect all these threads, the original promise, the pressure for cost savings, that accountability gap, the early failure of the planning process, what's the final takeaway from this deep dive into 2008?
I think the 2008 review is so critical because it proves that the key structural strains, the lack of accountability, the complexity that just crippled capacity, the unclear roles, these were not problems that grew over time. They were visible, they were documented, and they were actively hurting the system right at the beginning of its life.
And that financial frame, all that talk of efficiencies, value for money, and cost containment was so aggressively embedded from the start, it prioritized sustainability.
Right.
But the one tool you'd need for public transparency, the comprehensive financial audit to actually verify where the savings came from, that was deliberately kept out of scope.
Which means the public promise was always structured in a way that made it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to objectively, externally verify its financial integrity. It basically asks us to just trust that cost containment and service continuity can coexist without giving us the tools to prove it.
So we'll leave you with this core public question, something we hope you think about more. If the success of these huge social reforms is publicly sold on achieving cost containment and efficiencies, but the one mechanism for independent financial verification, the audit, is explicitly ruled out, how can the public ever truly know where those savings came from? It leaves this massive, lasting question about the integrity of those early cost reductions.
In our next deep dive, we're going to move forward in the timeline. We'll pick up the next major independent review and see which of these foundational structural strains from 2008 are still echoing the loudest today.
We'll talk to you next time on The Deep Dive.